Midnight passenger, I regret picking him up. The night had settled in thick and heavy, the kind of darkness that swallowed the road whole. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, empty except for the rhythmic flash of mile markers disappearing into the void behind me. My 18-wheeler hummed steadily beneath me, its dashboard glowing faintly in the dim cab light. I was on the last leg of my shift, exhausted but determined to push through. Then I saw him. A lone figure stood by the side of the road, thumb extended. A hitchhiker. Normally, I wouldn't stop. The rules were clear, never pick up strangers, especially in the dead of night. But something about him felt off. He stood too still, his posture rigid. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, and he carried no bags, no sign that he'd been traveling. Yet, despite the cold shiver that crept up my spine, I slowed the truck and pulled over. "Need a ride?" I called out through the cracked window. The man hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. As he climbed into the passenger seat, a chill seeped into the cab. The air carried a metallic scent, faint but distinct like rusted iron. The door shut with a soft click, and we were moving again. For the first few miles, he was silent. I stole glances at him when I could. His hands were pale and long-fingered, resting motionless on his lap. His breathing was almost non-existent. I cleared my throat, breaking the silence. "Where are you headed?" He turned his head slowly, too slowly, to face me. His voice was low, almost mechanical. "Just drive." I gripped the wheel tighter. Something about his presence felt wrong. The temperature had dropped significantly, and my breath misted in the air. But my gut told me to keep going, to not question him. Minutes stretched into miles. The road ahead seemed to blur, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Then he spoke again, his voice almost a whisper. "Do you know what happened here?" I glanced at him, my fingers clenching the wheel. "What do you mean?" He pointed out the windshield. "Right here. This stretch of highway. 5 years ago, a trucker picked up a hitchhiker, just like you did." A heavy weight settled in my chest. My pulse quickened. "The driver was found the next morning," he continued, his lips curving slightly. "But not the hitchhiker." The truck seemed to groan under its own weight as a sudden gust of wind buffeted its sides. The road felt narrower, the darkness more oppressive. I swallowed hard, forcing a chuckle. "You telling ghost stories now?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he smiled. No, not smiled. His mouth stretched, the corners of his lips pulling back too far, revealing rows of too sharp teeth. His skin paled, the texture shifting, becoming almost translucent. My grip on the wheel tightened as panic clawed at my chest. Then, the radio crackled to life. Static filled the cabin before a voice, my own voice, spoke through the interference. "Don't pick him up. Keep driving." My breath hitched. I jerked my head toward the hitchhiker, but he was gone. The passenger seat was empty. The air still carried that metallic scent. I slammed the gas pedal, speeding down the highway, my mind racing. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The GPS flickered, its screen glitching and distorting. The road signs I passed were no longer in English. They were in a language I didn't recognize, jagged, ancient symbols that seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw movement. A shape flickered in and out of existence, growing closer each time I blinked. My heart pounded. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there. Yet the mirror didn't lie, he was back. A whisper slithered through the truck's cabin, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't run from me." I yanked the wheel, nearly swerving off the road. The truck skidded before I regained control. My breathing was erratic, and sweat drenched my back. I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. The screen was black. Then, the laughter started. Soft at first, like the distant echo of something far away. But it grew. Louder. Closer. The entire truck shook as if something massive was moving inside it, unseen but very, very real. I did the only thing I could. I drove. Faster than I ever had before. The miles blurred, the world outside became a dark, endless void. But no matter how far I went, the laughter never faded. When dawn finally broke, the nightmare ended. I found myself at a truck stop, parked as if I had been there for hours. My fuel gauge hadn't moved. My logbook showed I hadn't driven at all. But the scent of rusted iron still lingered. And in the passenger seat, where he had sat, was a single black feather. I never picked up another hitchhiker again. Because some passengers never leave. The ride that ended on a dark road. It was late at night, the kind of night where the world outside seemed to be suspended in a thick, suffocating silence. The only sounds were the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustling of trees in the distance. The headlights of the car cut through the darkness like a knife, illuminating the endless stretch of road ahead. Carter had been driving for hours. He'd been on the road since dusk, the familiar highway stretching out in front of him like an endless ribbon. His phone was dead, and his car's GPS had stopped working somewhere in the middle of nowhere. But it didn't matter much, he wasn't in a rush. Just a man, driving to escape the noise of the world, trying to clear his head. He wasn't prepared for the stretch of road that lay ahead, though. This was no ordinary highway. It was an old, forgotten road, tucked away in the backwoods of the countryside, far from civilization. It was the kind of road people passed by without a second thought, assuming it was nothing more than a relic of the past. But as Carter continued to drive, he began to feel something unusual. It started with a chill in the air, creeping up his spine like an unseen hand. The temperature in the car dropped suddenly, and Carter shivered. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 2:47 a.m. There were no streetlights here, no signs of life. Just the road, the trees, and the dark, oppressive sky above. He felt uneasy, as though something was watching him. He could hear his breath quicken as he pressed the accelerator, trying to shake the feeling that he was being followed. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of his eye, a shadow moving at the edge of the road. Carter's heart skipped a beat, but when he turned his head to look, there was nothing. Only the empty road stretching on endlessly. Get a grip, Carter muttered to himself. It's just your mind playing tricks. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The road ahead seemed to grow darker, the trees on either side pressing closer to the car. The air became thick, almost suffocating. And then, just as he was about to convince himself it was all in his head, he saw it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. A figure, a tall, thin figure, standing just off the road. Carter slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring at him with an almost unnatural stillness. His heart raced. Should he stop? Should he drive away? But something inside him told him he had no choice. He had to stop. Reluctantly, Carter rolled down the window. His voice caught in his throat as he called out, "Hey, do you need a ride?" The figure didn't answer. It only tilted its head slightly, as though considering Carter. The figure was dressed in tattered clothes, the edges worn and frayed. Its face was obscured by shadows, but Carter could make out the faintest hint of pale skin and hollow eyes. "I'm not here to hurt you," Carter said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can give you a ride to the next town. It's not safe out here." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring. Carter's hand hovered over the gearshift, his mind racing. What was wrong with this person? Why wasn't he saying anything? And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and began to walk away. Slowly. Methodically. Its footsteps were almost silent on the road, like it wasn't even there. For a moment, Carter just sat there, staring at the spot where the figure had been. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something was horribly wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a person in need of help. Carter shook his head, trying to shake off the growing dread that was gnawing at him. Without thinking, he put the car in gear and drove forward, faster than before, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and with each passing second, the silence grew heavier. The trees grew denser, more oppressive, until the world outside the car seemed like a dark, unwelcoming void. And yet, despite the isolation, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still out there, following him. Hours seemed to pass, but Carter didn't dare look at the clock again. He couldn't bring himself to. His headlights illuminated only the road ahead, casting long shadows that danced along the edges of the trees. It was as though the night itself had swallowed up everything around him. Suddenly, his car sputtered. The engine stuttered, and for a moment, Carter's heart stopped. "No, no, no," he muttered, slamming his palm against the steering wheel. The car limped along, barely staying on the road. The engine groaned in protest as he struggled to keep control. And then, it happened. The car died. Right there, in the middle of nowhere. Carter let out a frustrated sigh, but the feeling of dread was back, stronger than before. The car was completely useless. He was stranded. He sat there for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. Should he walk? Should he wait? He wasn't sure, but the thought of being out there on foot, alone, in the dark, it terrified him. But just as he was about to open the door, he heard it. A knock. Soft, steady, and unmistakable. Knock. Knock. Carter froze. His breath hitched in his throat as he turned to look at the passenger side window. There, standing in the darkness, was the figure again. Its face was now fully visible. Pale, gaunt, with hollow, sunken eyes. It smiled at him, but it was not a smile of kindness. It was a twisted, malevolent grin, as though it was enjoying his fear. Carter's heart pounded in his chest. His hand shook as he reached for the door handle, but just before he could open it, the figure's smile grew wider. It stepped closer to the car, its movements unnervingly slow. The air around Carter seemed to thicken, pressing in on him, suffocating him. "Please," Carter whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know what you want, but leave me alone." The figure didn't respond. It only continued to smile, its eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. Carter could hear the faintest whisper, barely audible, but it was enough to send a chill racing down his spine. "You shouldn't have stopped." With a sudden lurch, the car's engine roared back to life, but it was no longer under Carter's control. The car jerked forward, speeding down the road, faster than it had ever gone before. The trees on either side blurred into streaks of shadow, and Carter slammed on the brakes, but it was no use. The figure was gone now, but Carter couldn't escape the feeling that it was still there, watching him from somewhere in the darkness. The car finally came to a halt, and Carter looked up, his heart racing. He was no longer on the road he had been driving on. He was in the middle of a dense forest, surrounded by towering trees. The world outside his car was now pitch black, impenetrable. And then, from the darkness, came a voice soft, like a whisper. "It's too late." Carter turned, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was there, standing just outside the car window once again. Its smile was wider than ever, stretching impossibly across its face. "You shouldn't have stopped," the figure said, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. "Now you belong to the road." And with that, the car's engine died again, and the darkness swallowed Carter whole. Whispers of the hitchhiker, sounds from the back seat. The road stretched endlessly before Sarah as she cruised along the desolate highway. The only sound breaking the silence was the hum of her car's engine. It was a late night, well past midnight, and Sarah had spent the entire day in a haze of work, trying to finish her last-minute assignments. Now, as she drove home from the city, she welcomed the quiet solitude of the road. The moon hung high in the sky, casting pale light on the lonely stretch of asphalt ahead. It was during these late-night drives that Sarah often found peace. The world seemed to vanish as she drove through the empty roads, the only company the occasional flicker of a distant light or the rustling of trees along the roadside. But tonight was different. Tonight, something felt off. Her grip tightened around the steering wheel, and a strange unease crawled up her spine. It wasn't just the exhaustion, it was something deeper, an instinctive warning. Something was watching her. She shook her head, trying to push the thought away, but it lingered. The darkness outside seemed heavier, more oppressive than usual. As she approached a particularly isolated part of the highway, Sarah noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. The faint glow of her headlights illuminated the scene, a man, tall and lean, draped in a long, dark coat, standing motionless in the night. His back was to her, and he didn't move a muscle as her car approached. She hesitated, her foot hovering over the brake. It was late, and she was far from civilization, but something about the figure's stillness tugged at her. There was no one else on the road, no other cars passing by. The isolated stretch of highway was eerily silent. The man slowly turned his head, his face partially obscured by the shadows of his wide-brimmed hat. But Sarah could make out his eyes, deep, hollow, and disturbingly vacant. Her stomach churned. Despite every rational thought screaming at her to drive away, she found herself slowing the car to a stop. The man slowly approached the passenger side window, and she instinctively rolled it down just a crack. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. The man didn't respond at first. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Sarah noticed that there was something wrong with the way he stood, as though he were too still, too unnatural, like a statue waiting to come to life. I need to get to the next town," he finally muttered, his voice low and rough. "Can you give me a ride?" Sarah glanced down at the empty road behind her, the endless stretch of blackness. Something told her not to, but at the same time, her compassion won out. He looked harmless, even though his presence felt unsettling. "Sure, get in," she said, unlocking the passenger door. The man didn't hesitate. He slid into the car with an unnerving smoothness, his coat brushing against the leather seats. As he settled into the passenger seat, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But she tried to push the thought aside and focused on the road. For a few minutes, the car was filled with an uncomfortable silence. Sarah kept her eyes on the road, glancing occasionally at the stranger out of the corner of her eye. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting in his lap, his gaze unfocused and distant. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to break the silence. "Does it matter?" The man's voice was flat, almost as if the question bored him. Sarah frowned but didn't press further. She had a strange sense of urgency, a feeling that something was coming, something dangerous. But she couldn't place why. She glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed that the road behind her was still empty, no other cars in sight. As the minutes passed, Sarah couldn't help but feel that the car was becoming colder. She turned up the heater, but it barely made a difference. The chill seemed to seep into her bones, and her breath fogged in front of her. Suddenly, she heard it. A soft whisper. At first, it was so faint she thought she'd imagined it. But then, the whisper came again, louder this time, from the back seat. "Turn back." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She glanced quickly at the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. She could feel the presence of the man beside her, but he hadn't moved. His eyes were locked on the road ahead, his hands still resting in his lap. "Did you say something?" Sarah asked, her voice unsteady. The man didn't respond. But the whispering continued, growing louder with each passing second. It was coming from the back seat, and it was unmistakably clear now. "Turn back, he's coming." Sarah's pulse quickened. She couldn't look in the mirror, she was too afraid to see what might be sitting behind her. She had to stay focused. But the whispers grew more urgent, more desperate. "Don't go forward. Don't." She slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, the tires skidding on the wet road. She quickly turned the wheel, her heart pounding as she glanced nervously at the rearview mirror. But to her shock, the back seat was empty. The man was gone. There was no trace of him. Her hands shook as she turned the car around, her breath shallow and rapid. She couldn't explain what had just happened, but she knew that something was wrong. Terribly wrong. As she drove in the opposite direction, she couldn't help but feel the weight of an unseen presence pressing in on her. The whispers returned, but they weren't coming from the back seat anymore. They were coming from the very air around her, swirling in the car like a cold, malevolent force. Turn around, it's too late. Panic gripped her chest as she sped down the road, her eyes darting from the rearview mirror to the windshield. In the darkness, she could make out shapes, figures moving along the side of the road, shadows that shouldn't be there. She could hear the rustle of something brushing against the car, but when she looked, there was nothing. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent, until they became an unbearable crescendo of voices, all speaking at once. Don't look back, don't stop, he's in the back seat. Her foot slammed down on the accelerator, the engine roaring in protest as she sped through the empty highway, desperate to escape whatever force was chasing her. But no matter how fast she drove, the whispers wouldn't stop. The presence in the car, whatever it was getting closer. Turn back, you're too far. The road stretched on, endlessly, and Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that the darkness was closing in around her. The whispers had turned to screams now, filling her ears, drowning out everything else. And then, in the rearview mirror, she saw it. A shadow, a figure, sitting silently in the back seat, staring at her with those hollow eyes. But when she turned to look directly at the back seat, there was nothing. The whispers stopped. The darkness took over.